If people could please move down the rows and fill all the seats, there's lots of people trying to get in. Thank you.
It's entire, but it's it's obviously we can work hard, but if you're not rewarded for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Still plenty of chairs around, so please do try and fill up all the rows as possible so there's room for standing for anyone that comes in a little bit late. Give it another minute or so.
Yeah.
My bracelet says free markets.
Very good.
Okay, let's we'll get going. We'll get going, everyone. Great. So we'll get going, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Think Tent. You'll be glad to hear that Steve Bray and the music has turned down a little bit for now. So the subject this afternoon is, can the Conservatives ever again be the party of low tax? Before I go into a bit of a blurb about that subject, just to introduce myself and the panel, my name's Darwin Friend. I'm the Head of Research here at the Taxpayers Alliance. And I'd like to say we've got a pretty star-studded panel, I'd like to say, to discuss this topic today. We've got Lord David Frost, member of the House of Lords, former Minister of State in the Cabinet Office, and Chief Negotiator for exiting the European Union. Next to him, we've got Reem Ibrahim, Acting Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Then on my far left, we have Greg Smith, who is the Member of Parliament for Mid Buckinghamshire and is now the Shadow Minister for Transport and Shadow Minister for Business as well. And then to my direct left, we have Rachel Wolfe, who is a founding partner at Public First and former Education and Innovation Advisor to the Prime Minister. Now, I'm not going to go on too long before I get my panellists to speak on this topic, because I don't think we really need to frame this discussion very much. We've already got a 70-year high tax burden after 14 years of a Conservative administration, and if you look at the data that's out there, it's currently on track to reach an 80-year high tax burden before the end of this decade, actually. And that's before we even get any budget changes exactly 1 month today from the new Labour government. And I think it's fairly understandable to see why the tax burden has gone up in recent years. Whilst the Conservatives, yes, did in the last year cut national insurance by about 4 percentage points, at the same time they did that, they kept income tax thresholds frozen, which more than offset the cost of them of cutting national insurance. So some of the questions we're going to discuss today. Have the Conservatives abandoned the idea of being the party of low tax? Did the mini-budget do irreparable harm to the low tax movement? How can the Conservatives make the case for the low tax economy? And which taxes should the Conservatives focus upon now that they're back in opposition? So hopefully these questions and many more we'll be able to at least start to answer in this session. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lord David Frost, who's going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then after every panelist has spoken, we'll go out for questions and answers. David.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for having me here too. The question is, can the Conservatives ever again be the party of low tax? Well, I think the answer is that yes, they can. Yes, we must, because it's a clear dividing line between us and the rest of the opposition. And the real question for me is not whether we must do that, but how we're going to do that. How are we going to win the intellectual argument to do it? And how, if we are lucky enough to be elected again, how we're going to make this happen? It seems to me we've got to do two things, really. The first is to focus on spending. Spending is what drives tax. Spending is what drives the politics of high taxation. So we must focus on spending rather than tax itself. And second, we've obviously got to get into, if we can, a sort of virtuous circle where growth, spending reductions, tax reductions, private sector growth begin to reinforce each other and the economy starts to grow again. Now, easy to say, much more difficult actually to make happen. In this country, since about 2000, the spending burden has been about 40% of GDP. It's obviously got much higher than that in the last few years. And there is lots of evidence from economic studies and so on that once that spending tax burden gets above about 25-30%, you start to have deadweight costs to the economy. Now, getting down to that sort of level is obviously extremely ambitious, but I think it's worth recalling why these high spending levels do have such harmful effects, because we've all got used to them over the years. But what you see happening with spending and tax levels at this level is that you get all sorts of harmful microeconomic effects. The microeconomy of public services starts to deteriorate quite fast as innovation gets squeezed out and the services focus on getting their funding rather than delivering the services. You see incentives on people starting to change as the taxation levels go up. Returns to capital start to fall away, and investment that would otherwise be productive ceases to be productive. You get massive deadweight costs, labour taxes in particular, but also the double taxation of savings and dividends that at low tax levels is a kind of theoretical problem, but at high tax levels is a very, very real problem. And also at these sort of levels, you've got vast churn in the economy. Most households, most people are both payers in and recipients out at the same time. That obviously, again, has a deadweight cost, but it means that payments to households have to be more targeted as the overall cost would otherwise be unbearable. You then get very high marginal rates as the spending is withdrawn. And that starts to have effects on the incentives to work, save, invest, and so on. And I argue, and I think the party ought to be arguing more strongly, that that's what we're seeing in the UK at the moment, have been seeing for the last 20 years or more, that it's a big part, not the only part of our productivity problem, and that we won't start to solve that problem unless we start to reduce the tax and spend levels. Now, within the party, it seems to me there are three approaches that could be taken. The first is, and I hear a lot of people saying this, unfortunately, that there's essentially nothing we can do about this high tax and spend levels. Everybody's got used to it. The politics are much too difficult. All we can do is put in place a sort of directed investment and industrial policy to try and raise the functioning of the economy, try and raise the growth rate. That's basically a sort of Gordon Brown type policy, really. It's been tried, it hasn't functioned particularly well, and I don't think, given how high the tax burden already is, that it's sensible to push any further down this road. Second opinion is pay lip service to tax reductions. Try and cut at the margin, do some cheese pairing on spending, talk about tax cuts to create a political distinction, but not really have an ambition to change the size of the state in any significant way. And that is probably the mainstream, I suspect, in the party. But where I think we should be is third place, which is to have a long-term plan to reduce the size of the state. And, I would say we should be aiming to reduce it over about 10 years to something like a third of GDP, 33% or thereabouts, and to use that 10-year period to put in place the sort of institutions and private sector support that enables individuals and companies to start taking the strain of that. Now, that's very, very ambitious. One needs to explain it. One needs to explain why. We need a very, very clear plan as to how we would do it if we were ever elected. But it seems to me that's the only way of really seriously reducing the size of the state. And it's the only way of avoiding the debates that we've had in the last few days of somebody picks on a subject, an area to cut, all the lobby groups, all the opponents immediately pile in and say you can't cut there, and everybody retreats. And we can't do it that way. We need to have a serious plan to reduce the size of the state overall and get back onto that virtuous circle that I was talking about at the start. And the sooner we start explaining that, setting it out, the better position we'll be in 28 and 29. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And to go second, Reem.
Hello, thank you, Darwin, and thank you to everybody for coming today. I think that David is right. Just initially, I think that the strategy around what it actually looks like for a low-tax economy to develop, the current situation that we are in is one in which we do have one of the highest tax burdens in a very, very long time. But the tax burden is not just how high the taxes are, but also how complex the tax system actually is. So we have so many different types of taxes. We have so many different exemptions for some of those taxes. So actually the tax burden is not just how high those taxes are, but also how complex the system is in itself. We're in a situation now where the Labour government are saying that they are not going to tax working people, but they are going to increase taxes. Now, we have no idea what working people actually means. Who counts as working people? Do I count as a working person? Do pensioners count as working people? So a conversation about those particular definitions actually does matter. There's also the element of the fact that there is a fundamental misunderstanding between the impact of tax and the incidence of tax. So the impact of tax is who initially pays it. So, for example, with sales taxes, businesses pay those taxes. Whenever you buy a product and you pay those particular products, you see that in those prices. But the incidence of the tax is all of you. It's the consumers. It's the people that actually bear the burden of those particular taxes. So I think, first of all, we need to have an understanding about who is actually being affected and the initial incidence of those particular taxes. I also think that, this goes back to what David just said, that actually, first, before we even talk about taxes, we need to start having a conversation about spending. And, we know over the last few years what actually happens when we start having a conversation about reducing the tax burden initially without having any kind of conversation about where that money is going to come from. And it is very dangerous territory, as we saw in 2022. The notion that actually austerity even happened is also a bit of a misnomer. So during the period of time that we were supposed to have had austerity, public spending only reduced by about 0.9% each year. It's, in the grand scheme of things, not very much. Austerity is in large respects a huge misnomer. So in the long term, we do need to have a conversation about where we are going to be reducing public spending. And many people in this room won't like this, but I think that actually a lot of this is the conversation about where the offering of the state actually looks like. So I'm going to use the example of pensions. We currently spend double the entire Ministry of Defence budget on pensions alone. So the entire Ministry of Defence budget on pensions alone. I think that that is absurd, and I think that those kind of conversations about where the money is coming from and who actually needs it needs to happen. Now, this goes back to the point that many pensioners, of course, have promised that if you pay into a system, that money remains in a pot, and then when you turn 65, you take that money out. That obviously isn't the case, and pensions are currently being paid for by working taxpayers today. So we need to be having conversations about, A, the fact that people in these generations have been lied to by the state, but also the fact that it's currently unsustainable. Pensions are going to completely outstrip any other department over the next few years, and actually we're going to be getting into a situation where it is physically unsustainable regardless. So what can we actually do about it? Let's have that conversation. I think we need to broaden VAT, so I think that we need to be ensuring that actually if we look at consumption taxes and broaden that and reduce direct taxes like income tax and things like capital gains tax. The goal is effectively to turn everything into a consumption tax because it is much less economically inconsequential. So things like income tax have much more bad economic consequences than things like consumption taxes, which don't have a huge effect on different spending, saving and spending measures by particular individuals. I think we need income tax with full tax relief for savings. And corporation tax, we need to have complete full expensing on everything. I think that those particular policies, in the first instance, will make those changes. I just want to make a very small point before I finish. We need to be having the kind of proper communication strategy around it. We need to be explaining to people why low taxes are better and why it is much more efficient for people to keep more of what they earn, because it is not only better economically, but also it is the moral and just thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reem. I appreciate that. Yeah, we don't know what Labour means by working people, but the people playing music outside, I think we can definitely say aren't. So we need to talk about spending as well as taxation, Greg. Why don't you fire away next?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I very much agree with David's structural analysis of the position that we find ourselves in now, and likewise Reem's point about complexity. But just on that point about how you define working people, I don't think anybody thought when Labour produced their manifesto and spoke on all of those platforms during the election and said they were going to be on the side of working people, they were defining that by, we're on the side of working people because at least you're not pensioners and we're going to come after you ruthlessly and vigorously and ensure you freeze this winter. It is an incredible position we found ourselves in, which we've got to put our hands up to as a party, having, we've got a lot to be proud of for the last 14 years, but we did let down the British public in many ways, one of which is the tax burden, and we've let this pretty shambolic, chaotic Labour government on a very low vote share take over, and they're going to do a lot of damage over the next few years. But to answer the question clearly and precisely, if we do not return to being a low-tax party, a genuine low-tax party along the grounds that David's analysis set out earlier, we simply won't get back to winning ways. We simply won't be able to excite the British public once again about a genuine Conservative plan for the governing of this country. And he's turning the volume up. I think that was actually a speech from about 2003, but never mind. Sorry, not many people remember the IDS turning up the volume speech. There we go. The central point that I'd make is Labour are messing up on an epic scale already. They are going to become electorally very low-hanging fruit very, very quickly. The challenge is, where do those voters then go? Because there's no automatic spring back to us unless we have earned it, unless we have re-earned the right to be heard, unless we have set out a genuine Conservative approach to the governing of this country. And I would argue that our approach to how much money we take off people as a state, how much money we take out of their income, how much money we take off them when they buy something, how much money we take off them when they die, how much money we take off them when they put petrol or diesel in their car. Don't get me started on EVs. is something that we have got to have a compelling argument over how we reduce that. And there are a number of challenges that I'm going to have to, again, say, put our hands up, we created for ourselves. And the first one, which Labour have doubled down on in the most spectacular way in one of their first bits of legislation, is, of course, the Office for Budget Responsibility, where we're now in a position where an organisation ranked 29 out of 31 economic forecasters for accuracy is the arbiter over whether we can or cannot afford something as a country, whether a chancellor is even allowed to go there on a tax cut or a tax rise or a spending increase or a spending decrease. We've actually got to get some more dynamic modelling going on in the Treasury. We've actually got to get some red teaming going on those economic forecasts. We all agree, right, that economic forecasting is not a precise science, that you are never going to get it 100% right all of the time, and that certainly the longer term you get in those forecasts, up to the 3, 4, 5, 10-year models, you're almost certain to get it wrong. So why are we allowing an unelected essential quango to dictate to any chancellor what they can and can't do on taxes? And that comes to another central myth that we have got to blow out of the water before we can start to make some of these arguments. And that's this horrible little phrase that has crept into every media report for as long as we were in government over the last 14 years, this weird phrase, unfunded tax cut, when actually we know that the vast majority of tax cuts don't need to be funded. We know that when George Osborne reduced the 50p rate to 45p rate, something like 3.4 billion extra flowed into the Treasury from that. We know that if we target those tax cuts right, you can generate actually more money into the Treasury as you take away those incentives to avoid or evade tax, and to set people free to reinvest some of their profits, to grow, to employ more people, to start a new product line. But my friends, I have spent most of today as Shadow Industry Minister in the Shadow Business and Trade team at our party's Business Day. I think it's pretty fair to say that they're not clambering to ask for their money back at this occasion, unlike the event in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference last week. But I think there is a very clear message coming from the businesses I've spoken to today, that if we want them to be growing, if we want them to be taking on more apprentices, more staff, starting those new product lines, the last thing we should have done in the last government is increase corporation tax. And I had that from businesses in my constituency. I represent 336 square miles of pure rural, but I've got some incredible pockets of advanced engineering, of precision engineering, the National Space Propulsion Centre at Westcott, where literal rocket science happens. And the number of businesses in my constituency who looked me in the eye after we put up corporation tax and said, we are cancelling new product lines, we are cancelling new investments, we are not taking on new members of staff for the time being because you have taken away our flexibility to do that with this corporation tax increase. We need to be very honest about the damage that that had and look to a way of getting it down yet further. And the last point I'll make before Rachel speaks and we move on to a more interactive session is that around personal taxation. And particularly, I think we need to, of course, look at all incomes, but we do need to look at this particularly perverse 60% marginal rate that creeps in over £100,000. There was some research published last week that one of the leadership candidates may have highlighted. There's been a fourfold increase in the number of adults finding themselves in that 60% marginal rate over the last 15 years. I mean, that is just absurd that the state could be taking that amount of income off individuals that are striving, doing well, probably putting a lot of money back into the economy. And I'm certainly of the view that we should not be in a position where, as a starter for 10, anybody should have more than 50% of their income take. And that's quite a punchy number in its own right, but you've got to start somewhere, and we've really got to do something about that 60% marginal rate. And I suspect we might actually find a group of unsuspecting supporters in the next couple of years that might discover just what the 60% marginal rate means. Because over the last few years, and it's a controversial and touchy subject, and I'm in no means advocating for this, but it is probably going to happen, that with MPs' pay going up by average income, average public sector wage increases, there's going to be a lot of people in the House of Commons in the next couple of years that suddenly find themselves in that 60% marginal rate, probably if current projections show through in around 2027, 28. So all of those hundreds of new Labour members of Parliament suddenly discovering what that actually looks like on their pay slips, they might even become very unlikely advocates for getting rid of that and doing a job for us before we have the ability to get back into government. But to answer the question straightforwardly, we have to, in order to win power again, and I hope that comes at the next general election, set out a clear, compelling and reasonable case to the British public to get them excited about a Conservative agenda where we're going to ask them and we're going to ask business to pay less tax.
Thank you very much, Greg. MPs facing tax rises. I think there might be hope of staving off whatever the Chancellor has planned for the budget yet. Last but by no means least, Rachel Wolfe.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a slightly personal preamble. I run a small to medium-sized business. I employ about 60 people. My taxes have gone up quite a lot in the last few years. I pay a lot more corporation tax. I now pay the apprenticeship levy. And my expectation is that my life is going to get a lot more expensive in the next year, or my company's life. I have a strong personal and corporate interest in lower taxes. And it must be said that over the last year, it's interesting so many small businesses have said that to you, Greg, because the environment has been that the business associations have broadly said that this corporation tax increase is just fine. So I have a strong personal interest. And the reason I say that as a preamble is because despite that, and I think this is what David was getting at, I think that if we are to get back into power at some point, we need to be very serious and serious-minded about what we think is actually required to get that tax burden down. One of the questions was, did the mini-budget do irreparable harm to the low-tax movement? No, I don't think it did. I think there are still plenty of people in this country who want lower taxes, and actually if we want to attract younger people back to the Conservative Party, they tend to be more in favour of lower taxes than older people. But I think it did put pay to the idea that we can do it entirely through borrowing. And we are already, as a country, spending, depending on your year, 9-ish% on debt interest. We are borrowing every year. And it is, I think, implausible to make a credible argument to the public that we are going to radically reduce taxes through borrowing. Which leads to the second thing that, again, is what David was talking about, but I want to sort of highlight a couple of areas where I think this is genuinely difficult and we need to be willing to face trade-offs. We need to be serious about spending. And we need to be serious about spending while being a party that I think wants to increase defence spending quite significantly over the next decade, because we're all worried about security threats, so that's going to go up. The two biggest sources of expenditure for our government, by some mileage, is health, most of which goes on older people, and pensions. Now, there are other things that I'm sure we'd all cut. I'm sure there are lots of people here who think HS2 was a total waste of money. I would have a lot of sympathy with it. That there are people who've been frustrated with expenditure on aid. All of that is true. It is minuscule by the standards of how we spend as a state. And so we need to have serious answers, which I don't think we yet have. I hope we will develop them, to how, over the next decade, you would significantly reduce expenditure on things like health as we get older and pensions. And I'm sorry, Greg, I'm going to slightly disagree with you here because I think this is really important. It really worries me when, as a party, we are simultaneously saying we are the small state party, we are the low tax party, and ending winter fuel payments is the worst thing that the Labour Party could possibly do. because we're not answering at any point what it is we would cut and what we would stop spending money on and where we think the trade-offs are. And until we are serious about that, it's not really obvious to me why the public should listen. That is not, to be clear, me saying, which maybe was David's admonition, that I think we should do nothing. Nor is it saying, by the way, that I think there isn't a lot of room for policies that encourage growth around deregulation, around planning reform, around changing the complexity of the tax system and who bears the burden. But it is saying that if we want to be the low tax party, we can't be the wishful thinking party, and we have to be people who have done the work and are willing to do the sums and say what we're going to spend less on and how. I will stop.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think there were some really interesting points from everyone, and I could ask quite a lot of questions and never get out to the audience. So I'm not going to abuse chairman's privilege. I'm going to go straight out to the audience for Q&A. If what you can do is just put your hand up, wait until someone with a microphone reaches for you, and then if your question is directed to a particular panelist, just say who. So could we go to the gentleman sitting down just here, right there, Joanna? Yep.
Hello, Stephen Ford. Just a member from Melton. Do you think it's sensible to means test the state pension?
Who would like to take that?
Yes. I think that there has to be a fundamental rethink about what the pension state offering is. Can I elaborate?
Yeah.
No, so I think that ultimately pensioners today have effectively been told, your entire life you pay into the system, and what happens is that pension pot stays within this treasury, and then when you turn 65 you take that money out, and that's what it is. But that's not true. And again, this is not me, I don't think we should be pitting older people and younger people against one another. I think we have to have conversations about how we can make the whole system work for everyone. And ultimately, pensioners today have been lied to by the system, by the government, and been promised all of these false promises. Now, let's be clear, I will not receive a state pension. It is fiscally unsustainable. By the time I get to 65, it won't exist. So we have to have a conversation about what we can really do. A quarter of pensioners are millionaires. They are asset millionaires. Now, a lot of that money is obviously in bricks and mortar. So they don't feel rich. It's not in their cash payments. Now, if we solve the housing crisis and build more homes, and that's a conversation that has been discussed across conferences this week so far, we can actually help last-time buyers just as much as we help first-time buyers. Now, if last-time buyers, people that have had their children have moved out of their homes and they've gone off somewhere else, and they're in these big family homes, and those people are able to downsize because they are A, exempt from stamp duty, that would be great, and B, if they were actually able to then move into homes that are much more suitable, they would feel wealthier, and there would be less of a need to spend huge amounts of money on the state pension. I also just want to quickly add, the state pension isn't a lot of money. You're getting a couple £100 a week. It really isn't that much. It's just the fact that we have an ageing population, and so the way in which it is tilted is towards older people. That's not to say that pensioners that receive the state pension are incredibly wealthy and they feel amazing about it. That's not the case at all. It's just that it's fiscally unsustainable, and my generation will never receive it, so we have to have a conversation about what the practical solution actually is.
Anybody else on the state pension? Or?
Well, yeah, and just on the pensions question more broadly, actually, I'm not sure I entirely agree with Reem, unusually, and not just because I'm quite a lot close to getting the pension that she is. It still seems some way off. I think it's possible to exaggerate the size of the problem, first point. Pensions are about 5% of GDP. They were 5% of GDP in 2010 when we took over. The reason it's not gone up is basically because the pension age has moved out. And I think it is a reasonable political aim to seek to hold that figure at about 5%. And not see it balloon. I don't see the need for it to get hugely smaller other than through economic growth. The reason I think that is twofold. One, it was government, albeit not a Conservative government, but it was government that wrecked the private sector system of pensions in the late 90s and early 2000s, and people have not had the ability to save for themselves in the way they ought to have, and government has to accept responsibility for that. And the second is that I don't think pensioners are in the same situation as everybody else, in the sense that if you take money off pensioners, they can't all immediately go out to work. The incentives are different. Some can, many can't. And I don't think it's wholly unreasonable to have a kind of minimum guarantee for pensions for pensioners at a certain age. So I take a sort of slightly different view on that. I don't think the system is unsustainable. Just because we're getting more elderly people, it doesn't logically follow that the public sector has to stump up for them. So we should be trying to hold at about 5% and, in my view, bring back a more private sector arrangement to begin to take the strain again.
The gentleman here.
I want to pick up on Greg Smith's point about the 60% marginal tax rate with a personal story. Yeah. 10 years ago, I was a 40% marginal rate taxpayer, and my late wife, who worked part-time, was a 20% marginal tax rate payer. When she died, I received a survivor's pension, but that then counted as my income and was taxed at 60%. So our household income gross went down because obviously the pension wasn't as much as she was earning, but our household marginal tax rate went from 40% to 60%. Would you agree that that's just fundamentally immoral as well as economically wrong?
Yes.
Anything
Straightforward, yes. I mean, it goes back to all the points that I made around it. It is a moral absurdity that the state should ever take 60% of someone's income off them in the first place. And in a position that you found yourself in, sir, that it beggars belief. That, I mean, look, HMRC don't really have a conscience, but it beggars belief that someone in your situation taking on a survivor's pension should suddenly find yourself materially worse off because of that. This is where you get into the moral case around tax as well as the economic case as to why high taxes are so crazy that we've got to stamp down on.
Okay, we'll take two questions in this round. So first, this gentleman here.
Just building on that moral case, let's say Reem stood by that door and wasn't going to allow anyone to leave, and then David came round and said, right, everyone has to give me £20 and put his hands in your pocket, everyone's pockets, and said, or else. And the reason being is a little old lady in a flat without electric or no food and she's not able to work. Does that make it morally right for David to put his hands in everyone's pockets and takes £20 out before they can leave? And would you do that?
Okay, and then the gentleman here as well.
I'd like to go back to David's point about reducing the size of the state. Getting it down to 33% would be a significant challenge. And the last time anybody tried to reduce the state to that level, I think, was Margaret Thatcher. Ever since then, with due respect, Greg, but all parties, all governments since then have put up taxes. Up and down, but basically they've just gone in one direction. And I accept what you say, that messing around at the edges, we see every time, even the tiniest decrease in a benefit is made. It makes very little difference, but there's a huge uproar, and it's almost impossible to do. So, to my mind, the only way that we can go about achieving that aim would be to go for privatizations. But the problem is that they got a bit of a bad reputation because we privatized some things like the railways, but just moved state monopolies into private monopolies without any competition. So the only way to do it and win public support and get better pricing and better service is to turn those state monopolies into private competitive businesses. And the big sort of beast elephant in the room here, with the largest part of the state, which was basically nationalized into some Soviet-style behemoth at the end of the war. We all know what it is. It's not working. It's not worked for many years, probably many decades, and it's probably one of the worst services in Europe, one of the worst around the world. Unfortunately, our healthcare system is broken, and we need to follow what every other country has done and create some kind of a competitive healthcare system. And that would help us to achieve those objectives.
Okay, thank you.
Can I jump in there very quickly?
Yeah,
Sorry, is that
sure.
all right? On the first question, so I do like the argument that taxation is theft. However, I think that doesn't cut through with most people. Thank you, appreciate it. I do think that it's a very nice thing. I used to talk about it when I used to do a lot of TikToks and talk about the fact that taxation is theft. However, the majority of people, that argument does not cut through, and actually, you know, ultimately people will start believing that actually the state does need to be doing something, so the money has to come from somewhere. But I do like the analogy. It's the same sort of analogy if somebody comes into your house and forces you to give them all your money, but they say, I promise it's going to a good cause and it's going to help you. Is that moral for you to be forced to give them your money? On the second point, there's so much in there on privatisation and public monopolies. Effectively, you know, a lot of the privatisation processes that we saw, especially with utilities, didn't end up working in the way that we might have wanted, and the predominant reason for that is the regulatory regime. So many utilities effectively had the regulatory regime when they were state-owned. The regulatory regime was moulded for that particular entity, and so when it was sold to the private sector, they had a competitive advantage. So that the regulatory regime was literally moulded for that particular utility organisation as well. So I actually think, I know the question is all about tax, I actually think that fixing regulation in this country is the most important political problem facing this country.
David, seeing as that question was directed at you as well, reducing the size of the state?
Well, I think it's... sorry, my throat's going. It needs explaining. That's the answer. We must try and explain to people that the path we're on is a path to unsustainability in the medium term, that we can't carry on just pushing up tax, taking on more responsibilities for government, running up more debt, because we don't ever sort of properly finance this through taxation, of course, and that the system cannot absorb another shock like COVID, like the banking crash. If another shock comes, we simply don't have the resources to deal with it. And I think we have to try and have the argument that says we're on the wrong track. We're now, you know, the highest levels of tax and spend we've had for 70, 80 years. We've got to turn that around and try and win that argument. I agree you can't just do it without it. I agree with you on the NHS. Obviously, I've written several times about that. It needs to change to a more efficient European-style system, which is the work of 20 years in itself, probably, to achieve that.
Rachel, would you like to jump in on this
Sure,
one?
I'll come in on both. I'm a conservative, not an arch-libertarian. I believe in the nation-state and its monopoly of force and its ability to levy as a monopoly of force. And I do not think that the future of the Conservative Party is to abandon all social security, health and education. So I understand your point, but I fundamentally disagree with it. On health, obviously none of us were involved in the 2019 election. David was, I was, thought that as a result of spending more than 350 million a week extra in the NHS, we would get significantly worse outcomes than we started with. The health system is a complete catastrophe. I agree with you. And it does need rethinking. And there are lots of things that in the wake of the abandoned Landsley reforms we have done over the last decade to make the NHS vastly more bureaucratic, vastly less choice and competition driven than Blair did. So, we absolutely need to accept we have just, messed up the NHS about as badly as it's possible to mess it up. That is a slightly different question from how much money we spend on it, because obviously many of these social insurance systems in Europe spend much more as a percentage of GDP than we do. So I completely agree we could be getting much more productivity gains from the NHS. I'm not sure it removes the decisions about who we are paying for and how we manage that as we get older. I think we do slightly need to treat them separately. So I'm the unpopular person on the panel today, sorry.
More questions. There's a young man here in glasses, Callum, just here. And then Joanna, the gentleman, just here. So we'll start with this young man here.
Thank you. It's a question for Greg and David, and I think it's actually Rachel's question, which is if you do want to reduce government spending as a percentage of GDP by 5 to 10 percentage points, what were the big ticket items that you would actually cut? And if you don't want to name specific things, at least where are the areas of public spending that you think the next Conservative government should be looking to make those savings?
Okay, and the gentleman here.
Yes. John Strafford of Beaconsfield. Following up from that last question, I always believed that universal benefits was socialism, and that the Conservative Party believed in targeted benefits because by doing so they could get more money to the very poor. And when it comes to the winter fuel allowance, we suddenly kind of flipped over and said everybody was in favour of it, instead of just saying, well, why don't we just tax the thing so that the poor aren't affected by it. But what other benefits should be cut? Because otherwise the national debt is just going to go higher and higher, and the last government said, well, we'll start reducing it in year 5. Year 5 never ever comes. Yeah. So can we have somebody commit to actually start cutting the debt year 1?
Thank you very much. On the first question, Greg, how to reduce government spending, big ticket items?
Well, look, to get a smaller state, of course, you've got to reduce government spending. What I don't think is a sensible thing to do right now is to set out those pitches in 2024 as to what we expect to find in likely 2029 as the state of the public finances. But I think that there will be some big ticket items where savings will be certainly quite easy and low-hanging fruit. Actually, to the previous question about privatisation, we're going to inherit a lot of renationalised industries that we will be able to make some decisions around. One of those is obviously they've basically already done it. It's through the Commons, it's off to the House of Lords, and that's rail renationalisation. That actually gives us a golden ticket to be able to look at how we can then re-privatise the railways, but in a way that actually works and that has competition and is better than the first way round we did it. But it's quite clear that the next 5 years are going to be pretty brutal in terms of spending decisions, and I think it would be foolish for any of us to sit in this conference in 2024 and set out an exact manifesto and pitch for what we expect to find in 2029. That is the job for 2028, 2029, the production of our next manifesto. And of course, the actual answer to a lot of that, to maintain a smaller state, is to grow the economy. It's that false narrative between do you always have to slash, well, in some areas, potentially, but if you grow the economy but don't tax it to death, you actually get to the same place. But I would be particularly interested in looking at how we then re-privatise things, starting with railways, that this government is undoubtedly going to nationalise. I suspect water will enter the frame at some point over the course of this Parliament, and we're going to have to think very carefully about how we do it in a better way that will actually reap rewards both ways.
Lord Frost, I think you were also mentioned in that question, big ticket items to cut in terms of spending.
Yeah, well, as has been said, the three big areas of spending are pensions, NHS, and benefits, other benefits sort of broadly drawn. Those are the main discretionary areas. I've said what I've said on pensions. I think that we have to avoid basing our case on the answer to that question, because it can't be taken in isolation. What we need to do to get the economy going is to get markets working better in many areas to push up the rate of growth. That in itself begins to reduce the burden of spending. We need to have as I said, a 5 or 10 year plan to hold these big ticket areas at least at where they are in cash terms, and ideally take some of the spending out. We need to have a plan to support the institutions, to get the private sector to take some of the spending burden. And that obviously is going to take time. I wouldn't be quite so dismissive in the short run of all the other areas of spending as well, because they do add up. International development spending, the 10 or 20 billion we spend on the net zero policy every year, the subsidies to railways, university funding, all of this stuff does add up if you're trying to take costs out of the budget over time. So, it needs to be a bigger plan than just saying we're going to cut spending. It's got to be a plan for reviving the British economy by bringing back markets and incentives to the way it works, and then bringing down tax and spending as part of that programme and getting on this virtuous circle that starts to get us growing again.
Reem, I think you wanted to jump in on the second question about cutting universal benefits and the debt as well.
Yes, I did. Thank you. So I think that I just wanted to mention a point about long-term sickness benefits, which of course Sir Keir Starmer did talk about over the last week, and effectively said a lot of those people need to go back to work, which is absolutely right. So just to be clear here, 1/10 of working age people are on long-term sickness benefits. 1/10. That's 10% of people are on long-term sickness benefits. It's absolutely astronomical. That's increased by 500,000 since 2019. So a lot of those people that end up getting onto long-term sickness benefits as a result of the government relaxing the rules around the pandemic, around the time of the pandemic, effectively has meant that so many young people are ending up on long-term sickness benefits and not getting back to work. Now, this goes back to David's point. It's not just about reducing spending on those particular people, but actually, if those people are working, the economy as a whole will become much more productive. So, in terms of as a share of GDP, we're actually growing the size of the pie rather than also reducing how much of that is being spent as well. It's also just on a moral point. I think those particular people that can work but are incentivised not to, I don't just think it's a waste of taxpayer money. I don't just think it's a waste of hard-earned people paying those particular amounts of money to the government and it going on people that can work. It's also a huge, huge waste of human potential. There are people out there that could be working, that could be contributing, that aren't.
So we've got a few minutes remaining. So I know we've got two questions just here. So if you start with the gentleman in the jacket, yep.
Thank you very much. My name's Alan Young. I'm from the Westminster Conservative Association. I think this runs the risk of being quite technical for the average voter, and I think we need to think very carefully about how we message this and the signals that we send. And there are some really fundamental points here. Why, for example, do we live in a country where the more people earn, the more successful they are, the more they contribute to the economy? Not only the more tax they pay, but the higher rates of tax, particularly on income tax. And I think we need to get quite radical about this and start thinking about saying to people, actually, the more you earn, the more you contribute, the less you'll pay in percentage terms, even though overall our tax take from you might be much greater than it would otherwise. Thank you.
And the gentleman next to him, yep.
Yeah, my name's Howard Nelson. I'm chairman of my own company, similar to Rachel in some ways. And I keep getting requests for ideas, and if I may give you one or two ideas very quickly. Raise the pension age to Raise the pension age to 70. Yeah, it's got to get there. Sorry, David, it's got to get there. It's unsustainable where it is now. And I'm saying that when I've got a gentleman who's 65, he's going to be 66, and he says he can't wait to retire. I'm sorry, it's got to go up to 70. The other things that I think we need to look at are the really big ticket items that nobody's addressing, neither party. There's a 2.7 trillion black hole in public sector pensions. Why won't anybody talk about it? It's totally unsustainable. Yeah, I've got an office manager who works for me. She works extremely hard in my company. Her sister is in the state, and she just can't wait to retire to get a huge pension. We have to really look at these big ticket items. The other thing I would suggest in terms of young people who aren't voting at all for this party is how do you incentivise them to vote the party? Don't charge them any tax until they're 21.
I'd like that.
I thought you would, Reem. On that second question, Rachel, do you want to pick up on that one?
I really love your first two. And I agree, those are the serious trade-offs and questions we have to address. And actually, although this has a short-term impact, I think a huge proportion of people in the public sector would much rather have slightly higher pay now, as opposed to these enormous liabilities that it's not at all clear that we can afford anyway. So I completely agree. I actually don't agree with your third for a principal reason. I know this was supposed to be the low tax panel. But I think as Conservatives, we have made a terrible error in having this idea that what we're supposed to be doing is taking lots of people out of tax altogether. Because what that does is remove this sense of contribution and reciprocity in society and make the conversation about tax always about other people. And I think the basic principle that we are all in this, we are all having to pay for this stuff, health is not free, is really important. But I love two of your three.
And who wants to pick up on the first question about how to popularise the message? Reem?
I just want to say, because I think that ultimately, so 53% of 18 to 34-year-olds believe that socialism is the ideal economic system, okay? So young people in this country do not believe in free markets, do not believe in capitalism, and they do not believe that they have a stake in society. The best way for us to get there, the best way for us to solve intergenerational inequality is to get those people on the housing ladder, because what ultimately happens is people end up owning a home, they end up feeling like they have a stake in society, they have a family, they have children, and they become Conservative voters. Now, I'm not here to tell all of you and convince you how to get the Conservative Party in government, but what I am saying is that for people to feel as though they have a stake in society and to reduce the tax burden, and in order for them to actually believe in the society and believe in capitalism, they have to become homeowners. On messaging, we have to ensure that people feel as though those messages are very, very clear and they are directly to them. You can have more of your own money in your own pocket. I think those sort of very, very simple messages for people are very, very clear. It's the best way to ultimately make people feel as though they have a stake in society, but also that this country is worth living in.
And we have time for one very final, very quick question. We will go, gentlemen, right here.
What's your opinion of the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility? Should it be reformed or dismantled?
Greg.
Well, I think I already answered that in the opening comments. The problem is they are never right. They have been cumulatively £550 billion out in all their projections since they were started. Yet they're put on some sort of altar as the saints that know everything about the economy, and we've got to get away from that. We've got to have multiple forecasters all giving their own different opinions on the way the economy is going, so that whoever is Chancellor can see who they believe at the time. To put it all in the hands of one organisation is just crazy.
Rachel.
I'm going to mildly defend the OBR, but by making a different point, which is we have to recognise how much of what the OBR says that we dislike is our own decision. We decide the measures that they go against. We decide whether it's overarching GDP or GDP caps we measure against. We decide what the fiscal rules are. We decide if we're going for some fantastical 5-year debt thing. It is not the OBR. And just as we used to do it with Europe, there is a risk that we do not heal ourselves because we are so keen on blaming other institutions.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. I'm afraid we are fresh out of time, but thank you very much for joining this discussion. I think it's safe to say that everyone on the panel, to one extent or the other, wants to see a lower level of taxation. I'm not as confident that we're going to see it in the next 5 years, but you never know. I may be proven wrong. But before you head off, just a couple of things. Firstly, I'd like you all to thank the panel of David, Greg, Rachel and Reem in the usual way. Secondly, if you have a mug or a glass, could you just pop it on the side where you picked it up from before? And finally, I'm going to shill. We have another TPA event coming up next on removing the shackles of the state. So if you want to stay around for that, feel more than welcome to.
Thank you so much.